The third dead calf lay by the creek bed, its belly swollen tight as a drum in the merciless August heat. Arthur Bishop didn't need to get closer to know the cause. It was the same wasting sickness that had taken the first two, a fever that started with a tremor in the legs and ended a day later with the animal unable to stand. The creek itself, usually a reliable artery of life for his small herd, had turned sluggish and foul, a pale green scum clinging to the rocks. His father had always said the land gives and the land takes. Right now, in the summer of 1878, it felt like all the land in the Montana Territory wanted to do was take. He had 27 head of cattle left, the entirety of his inheritance and the only thing standing between him and utter failure. His savings were gone, spent on bottled remedies from the catalog that did nothing but sour the air with the smell of turpentine. He was one bad week away from having to sell out to Jedediah Sterling, the man who'd been circling his property like a vulture for the past year, his polite inquiries about Arthur's health feeling more like a threat each time. That was the thought turning in his gut when he saw the flicker of color on the road that cut along his property line. It was a woman walking alone under the punishing sun. As she drew closer, he saw she was Chinese, clad in a tattered light pink prairie dress that was a strange and delicate thing against the harsh landscape. It was stained with the dust of the road and torn at the hem, a fragile flag of surrender. She stumbled, catching herself on a fence post, and he saw the exhaustion etched on her face. Her hands were empty. She had nothing. He had next to nothing. It was a poor match. But he couldn't just leave her there. His father had raised him better than that. He walked down the slope from the creek, his boots sinking into the dry soil. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched, her eyes wide with a fear that looked old and deep. She said nothing, just watched him, her body coiled as if ready to run, though he doubted she had the strength to go 10 yards. "You need water," he stated. It wasn't a question. He gestured toward the small clapboard house and the well beside it. "I'm not going to hurt you." She hesitated, her gaze flicking from his face to the road ahead, as if measuring the danger of staying against the impossibility of going on. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she followed him. He worked the pump until the water ran cool and offered her the dipper. She drank greedily at first, then more slowly, as if remembering herself. When she was finished, she handed it back, her eyes downcast. "You alone?" he asked gently. She nodded again, a small, jerky movement. She offered a few words in a language he didn't understand, the sounds like soft bells, but the meaning was lost. Then she tried English, her voice a thin whisper. "Man, gone." She pointed down the road, then made a gesture of a wagon driving away. Leave. Abandoned. A mail-order bride, most likely, brought over to marry some miner or railroad man who had lost his nerve or changed his mind. Arthur had heard the stories. It was a cruel business. "I don't have much," he said, thinking of the empty pantry and the dying cattle. "But you can't stay on the road. You can sleep in the barn. It's warm and dry. I've got horses in there, but they're gentle." Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time he saw something other than fear in them. It was a flicker of appraisal, of a keen intelligence weighing his offer. She gave another small nod. He led her to the barn, the familiar scent of hay and horsehide a comfort to him, though he couldn't guess what it smelled like to her. He pointed to a clean stall filled with fresh straw. "You'll be safe here," he said, and left a bucket of well water just inside the door. He didn't know her name, and he didn't ask. For now, it was enough that she was out of the sun. But as he walked back to his small house, the weight of his own troubles returned, heavier than before. He now had one more mouth to feed and a herd that was walking toward its grave. The next morning, 2 more cows were down, their breathing shallow. A feeling of cold dread washed over Arthur. He was watching his future die on its feet. He was so consumed with his own misery that he almost didn't notice the woman standing by the corral fence, watching the sick animals with an unnerving intensity. She was no longer just a frightened creature. Her posture was different. It was focused, analytical. She pointed to one of the trembling cows, then to her own stomach, and made a churning motion with her hand. She looked at him, her dark eyes demanding. "Water?" she asked, pointing toward the foul creek. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice flat. "It's the water, or something in it." She shook her head, a sharp, decisive movement. She pointed to the cow's mouth, where a thin line of foam had gathered. Then she pointed to the pasture, to the sparse, sun-scorched grass. She walked to the fence line, bent down, and plucked a weed with a small purplish flower. She held it up to him, her expression urgent. Before he could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon made them both turn. It was Jedediah Sterling, dressed in his Sunday best on a Tuesday, a sure sign he was on a mission. He pulled his horse to a halt, his gaze taking in the scene: Arthur, the strange woman, and the sick cattle in the corral. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "Morning, Bishop," Sterling said, his voice smooth as butter. "Having some trouble, I see." He didn't wait for an answer, his eyes fixing on the woman. "Found yourself some help?" "She was on the road, needed a place to stay," Arthur said, his jaw tightening. Sterling's eyes narrowed. "You're a charitable man, Bishop, taking in strays of all sorts. But you have to be careful. Some things are more trouble than they're worth." He gestured to the dying cows. "This sickness, it can spread. The other ranchers are getting worried. A man has to be responsible for his property and his company." The threat was unmistakable. Sterling was painting him as reckless, not just a failure. The woman, who had been watching the exchange, stepped back toward the barn, the purple-flowered weed still clutched in her hand. "My herd is my business, Sterling," Arthur said, his voice low. "It becomes everyone's business when it threatens to ruin the whole valley," Sterling countered, his polite mask slipping. "I'll renew my offer. Cash. Enough for a train ticket to wherever you want to start over. It's a better end than quarantine." He let the word hang in the air, a final, poisoned dart. Then he tipped his hat. "Think on it." He clicked his tongue, and the wagon rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving a thick silence behind. Arthur felt a tremor of rage, followed by a wave of cold despair. Sterling was right. A quarantine would be the end. He would be trapped here with his dead cattle and his failure. He turned, expecting the woman to have disappeared into the shadows of the barn, but she was still there, watching him. She stepped forward and held out the weed again, more insistently this time. She said a single word in her own language, then tapped the purple flower. She pointed to the hills behind the house. She mimed picking plants, then grinding them, then feeding them to a cow. It was a long shot. It was madness. He was a cattleman. He knew his animals and his land. He didn't believe in folk remedies from a woman he didn't know. But then he looked at the cows, at the visible proof that everything he did know had failed. What did he have to lose? "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. "All right, show me." For the next 2 hours he followed her into the rocky hills under the blistering sun. She moved with a purpose he hadn't seen in her before, her eyes scanning the ground. She ignored plants he recognized and sought out others he had always considered worthless scrub. She found a tough, spiky-leafed bush with a root that smelled like ginger, and a pale, mossy lichen that grew only on the shaded side of granite boulders. Her torn pink dress seemed absurd in the rugged terrain, but she paid it no mind. Her hands, he noticed, were not the soft hands of a sheltered bride. They were capable, her fingers nimble as she dug roots from the hard-packed earth. They returned with 2 burlap sacks full of strange-smelling herbs, roots, and leaves. In the barn, she worked with a quiet efficiency that amazed him. She crushed the roots with a rock, shredded the leaves, and mixed them with hot water he brought from the house, creating a thick, dark mash. The smell was bitter and earthy. She gestured for him to help hold the head of the sickest calf, a young heifer that could barely lift its neck. He held the animal steady while she gently spooned the mixture into its mouth, stroking its throat to make it swallow. They did this for all 5 of the sick animals. It was slow, exhausting work. When they were finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The woman looked at him, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. She had done all she could. Now they could only wait. Arthur watched Sterling ride out of town, knowing the man was spreading poison of a different kind. Even if a miracle happened here in his barn, Sterling was making sure the rest of the world would only see a fool and a heathen. The thought settled like a stone in his gut. A man could survive a dying herd, but it was harder to survive a ruined name. That night, Arthur sat on a stool in the barn, a lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He couldn't bring himself to go back to the empty house. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the strange medicinal smell of the poultice. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, sat on the other side of the central aisle, methodically cleaning the dirt from the remaining roots with a small knife. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a shared vigil. One of the sick calves let out a low groan. Arthur's head snapped up, his heart pounding. But the animal simply shifted its weight and settled back into the straw, its breathing seeming a little less ragged than before. It wasn't much, but it was something. The woman looked over at him, her work paused. "You're home," she said, her voice soft. She gestured around the barn, then toward the house. "Father give you?" "My father, yes," Arthur replied, surprised by her clarity. "He homesteaded this place. Died 2 years back." She nodded slowly, her eyes full of a deep, ancient understanding. She took a piece of charcoal from a small pouch at her waist and, on a clean patch of the hard-packed dirt floor, she drew a character. It was intricate, a series of delicate, deliberate strokes. She pointed to the drawing, then to herself. "Leanne." "Leanne," Arthur repeated. The name felt right. She then drew another character beside the first one. She pointed to it. "Father," she said. Then she made a motion of grinding herbs, the same motion she'd used in the hills. "Healer." The pieces clicked into place. She wasn't just some girl. Her knowledge wasn't a lucky guess. It was taught. It was inherited. "Your father was a doctor?" he asked. Leanne nodded. She looked down at the pouch at her waist. She untied it and carefully tipped its contents into her palm. A few dried seeds, a small, smooth river stone, and a tiny, folded piece of silk. She unfolded the silk. It was embroidered with the same character she had drawn for healer. "He give me," she whispered, "for new life." Her face clouded over. "Man on wagon. He promise big farm. Promise help my family. He take money. Then he say I am not quiet, not good wife. He say I know too much." She looked at her hands, the hands that had just saved Arthur's cattle. "He leave me on road." A cold anger settled in Arthur's chest. The man hadn't just abandoned her. He had stolen from her family and discarded her for the very skill and intelligence that made her who she was. Arthur saw not a victim, but a survivor, a woman of immense strength and knowledge, betrayed by ignorance. He felt a sudden, sharp shame for his own initial pity. She didn't need his pity. She deserved his respect. "My father," Arthur found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "He always said this land was a dream, but most days it just feels like a fight I'm losing." Before Leanne could respond, the sound of hoofbeats and men's voices broke the stillness of the night. Arthur stood, his hand instinctively going to the pitchfork leaning against the wall. A moment later, 2 lanterns appeared in the wide-open doorway of the barn, silhouetting 3 figures. Jedediah Sterling was in front, a smug look on his face. Behind him stood the territorial sheriff, a man named Cutler, and another rancher, Peterson, whose property bordered Arthur's to the north. "Bishop," Sheriff Cutler said, his voice holding a note of official regret, "sorry to bother you so late. Mr. Sterling here has filed a formal complaint. Says you've got a plague on your land and you're refusing to deal with it properly. Says you're using unorthodox methods." His eyes flicked to Leanne, who had risen to her feet and stood half hidden in the shadows of a stall. "I'm handling my own affairs, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice tight. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Cutler replied, stepping into the barn. He peered into the stall at the sick calf. The animal, which had been nearly comatose that afternoon, lifted its head and blinked in the lantern light. Cutler's eyebrows rose in surprise. "It's a public health concern. I have to place your property under quarantine until we can get a territorial veterinarian out here. That could be weeks. No animal in or out." It was a death sentence. His healthy cattle would be worthless, and he'd have no cash to buy feed for the winter. Sterling had won. "Furthermore," Sterling cut in, his voice dripping with false concern, "harboring a foreign transient with no papers, who may well have brought this sickness with her, it's a danger to the community. For her own good, and for ours, she needs to be taken into town." They weren't just coming for his ranch. They were coming for her. Arthur looked at Leanne. She stood straight and proud, her fear hidden behind a mask of calm dignity. He saw her journey in his mind, the ocean, the promises, the betrayal, the dusty road. He had offered her a safe place in his barn. If he let them take her, that promise would be a lie. He would be no better than the man who had left her on the road. He made a choice. It was not a choice for his ranch, or his finances, or his reputation. It was a choice for the man he wanted to be. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the men and Leanne. "Her name is Leanne," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She is a guest on my property, and she is the reason these animals are still breathing." He looked directly at Sheriff Cutler. "The quarantine is your duty. I understand that. Post the notice. But she stays. And you, Sterling, you and your friend can get the hell off my land. Now." Sterling's face flushed with anger. "You're a fool, Bishop. You're choosing that over your whole future." "It seems I am," Arthur said quietly. Sheriff Cutler looked from Arthur's determined face to Sterling's sputtering rage. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "I'll post the notice on the gate, Arthur. I'm sorry it came to this." He gave Sterling a hard look. "The rest is between you men. This isn't a legal matter for me tonight." He turned and walked out of the barn. Peterson, who had been silent the whole time, gave Arthur a conflicted look before following the sheriff. Sterling stood there for a moment, his victory soured. He stared at Arthur with pure venom. "You'll regret this. When you're starving this winter, you'll remember this night." He spun on his heel and disappeared into the darkness. Arthur stood for a long time, listening to the sound of their horses fade away. He had won the skirmish, but he knew Sterling was right. He had likely just lost the war. He turned back to Leanne. She was looking at him, her dark eyes shining in the lantern light. She took a step forward and placed a hand gently on his arm. She said nothing, but he understood. It was the first time anyone had stood for her in this new, hard country. And in that shared silence, in the warm, breathing space of the barn, Arthur didn't feel like a man who had just lost everything. He felt like a man who had finally saved something that mattered. October arrived with a sharp wind that promised an early winter. Arthur Bishop stood on his porch, watching his herd graze in the pasture. They were healthy, all of them. Their coats were thick and their movements were strong. Not a single animal had been lost after that night. The quarantine notice, weathered and curled, still hung on his gate, a reminder of the choice he had made. But it no longer felt like a death sentence. A week after the confrontation, Peterson had shown up at his door, hat in hand. The sickness had jumped the creek to his property. He was desperate. Swallowing his pride, he asked if Arthur's guest might know what to do. Arthur had looked at Leanne, and she had simply nodded. They had spent a day gathering the herbs on Peterson's land, and she had shown him how to prepare the remedy. Peterson's herd was saved too. Word began to travel, not as loud gossip, but as quiet, respectful murmurs between ranchers who valued results over prejudice. Jedediah Sterling's downfall was just as quiet. His own herd, the largest in the valley, had caught the sickness last. Too proud and too stubborn to ask for the heathen cure he had publicly mocked, he lost nearly half his cattle before the first snows fell. His financial ruin was the talk of the town, a cautionary tale told over whiskeys at the saloon. Arthur had sold 2 of his healthiest bulls to Peterson for a price that made him blink. With the money, he had ridden to the territorial office. He returned with a deed. That evening, he and Leanne sat at his small kitchen table. He pushed the paper across to her. It was a legal homestead claim, properly filed, for 40 acres of his own land, the section with the creek and the hills where the herbs grew. "This is yours," he said. "No one can make you leave." Leanne traced the letters of her name on the document. Her English had improved remarkably over the past months. They spent the evenings reading from his father's old books. "In my home," she said softly, her eyes not leaving the paper, "a woman cannot own land." "This isn't that home," Arthur replied. "Here she can." She finally looked up at him, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it lit up the small, plain room. Now, standing on the porch, he watched her walking up from the creek, her basket full of the roots and leaves she was drying for the winter. She no longer wore the tattered pink dress. She wore a sturdy canvas skirt and a simple cotton shirt, practical clothes for a woman of property. She stopped beside him, following his gaze to the healthy cattle. "The water is clean now," she said, her voice clear and confident. "The land is resting." Arthur looked at her, at this woman who had arrived with nothing and had ended up saving everything. He had offered her shelter in his barn, a simple act of decency. In return, she had shown him that a man's real wealth wasn't the land he owned or the cattle he raised. It was the character of the people he chose to stand with and the courage to trust in a knowledge different from his own. The coming winter would be hard, but for the first time in years, Arthur Bishop wasn't afraid. He was home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.